Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to XARM, the most absurd, ill-advised, and frankly unbelievable combat sport to ever be conceived by the flawed human intellect.
Both fighters ready to go. Cordrey looks like he's giving up an awful lot of weight to the shorter Steen. This is
I wanted to find something in the fighting sport business that would work on a small screen. We really wanted to have a sport where there'd be no ground grappling, because that's boring in MMA.
It's somewhat borderline insane.
I will have 10 million fans for this sport by 2015, easily.
Okay, now if you're dazed and confused and wondering what it was you just watched, that was footage from the initial pilot episode of XARM, which aired back in 2008. The rules of XARM are at the same time very simple and extremely unclear and muddy, but it starts with two competitors who square up head-to-head against each other on a 28 by 16-inch arm wrestling table. Then each competitor has their lead arm strapped to the other, so they literally cannot move, and they unleash spastic hell on each other for the next 60 seconds.
Steen comes with the right hand, trying to set his man up, trying to get a little distance between the angles. There is a pin right there. Look at the left. He's getting out. Steen is on Twitter Street. He has no idea where he's at.
You can win an XARM competition either on points, on submission, or a knockout. Yes, a knockout. Now, of course, you can pin the other guy's arm just like in a regular, non-psychotic arm wrestling match, but that doesn't seem to result in a match win in XARM. And once again, I just have to stress, throughout the entire match, each competitor is literally duct taped to the other.
Oh my goodness, we've got duct tape now. These guys aren't going anywhere. Duct tape can hold together anything, anytime. Seen to hold together airplanes.
And this environment, where the actual arm wrestling never really mattered, resulted in two men or two women beating the living daylights out of each other without the ability to properly protect themselves or to move away. People punched, they threw kicks, they threw elbows, and even a few arm bars were attempted.
I see the doctor coming up, make us, you know what? Safety first, always. Safety first, XARM, that's what we're about here.
That was a lie.
The brave competitors who entered the meat grinder that was the first ever XARM event were competing for a grand total of $10,000, plus a $100 bonus every time they pinned an opponent's arm. In other words, they were handing out concussions for peanuts. An IMDB entry of dubious accuracy estimates the total budget for the show at $50,000. And when you look at the talent, the set design, and the green screen work on this show, well, it's pretty evident they weren't working with much.
You told us that he was a big marshmallow. You're gonna roast him. Is that what you did here today?
Art, that is one confident champion who loves marshmallows.
Well, you know, from this point on, Bond advances to the semifinals in the XARM heavyweight tournament.
Fun fact, Jennifer England there came from WWE's reality show Diva Search back in about 2006. And since then she's worked as a model for various programs like The Price is Right and something called Bikini Destinations. Now, back to XARM. You may be wondering at this point, how in the holy hell did this thing get produced and wind up on TV? Well, it was started by this guy, Art Davie. He's one of the original founders of the UFC, he's in the UFC Hall of Fame, and he helped bring K1 kickboxing to America. See, according to interviews done at the time, Davie had a problem with a lot of the ground grappling techniques that were taking over the UFC. He felt they were too boring and that they would be the death of the company, not being interesting enough to the younger male audience. Boring. So was his solution to create a UFC competitor with slightly different rules to encourage stand-up fighting? No, of course not. It was apparently to create a psychotic hybrid of arm wrestling and backyard fights.
XARM is a brand new combat sport. In a sense, it's beyond ultimate fighting. It takes place at a table. The two fighters are tethered to the table. They're locked hand to hand. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. So we think we're going to be exciting fans who say boxing's interesting. This has got even more punch per ounce than that sport and MMA.
And he held the first ever XARM event in 2008, with the backing of Piranha Entertainment, a TV production company that had worked with the likes of Microsoft and Starbucks before, according to an article on MMApayout.com.
Hello everyone, I'm Gary Cruz with color analyst and the creator of XARM, Art Davie.
Gary, great to be with you again. And we've got $10,000 on the line and the title of XARM Heavyweight Champion.
So let's meet our two competitors.
Now, to be completely fair to Davie, there was another motivator for creating XARM, and that was the need to produce a sporting event that could be viewed effectively on a smartphone. The idea was that the fighters, being strapped together and unable to move apart or around any ring of any sort, would create action that would only happen in a very narrow field of vision, thus making it easier to display on a phone-sized screen. The program aired on something called Ripe TV, which back then was a digital video-on-demand programmer who catered to the likes of young male demographics. They also happened to shut down very soon after XARM aired. The actual competitors in XARM seemed to be a mix of regional MMA hopefuls you'd never heard of, some actual arm wrestling guys, and just some huge men. The live events at this time, and it is unclear how many were actually produced, were supposedly all held on Native American casinos because XARM couldn't be licensed by any sports governing body in any state, which, when you watch the program, you kind of understand. To the surprise of no one, it didn't take off. But Davie, nonetheless, seemed resolutely convinced that his bizarre concoction of arm wrestling, street fighting, and copious use of the letter X could actually rise to rival the UFC in popularity. It would take him 4 more years of shopping around XARM before his dream became slightly more of a reality. And in 2011, Davie relaunched XARM, this time with the backing of a company called Endemol, who were involved in the production of popular reality TV shows like Fear Factor and Big Brother. It's probably no surprise then that the relaunch of XARM came with a reality show called XARM Boot Camp, which chronicled all of the trials, tribulations, and cringe-worthy storylines of the competitors who were gearing up for their first XARM event. Now, this time around, XARM had a different distributor for their content. This time, it was YouTube gaming network Machinima, who of course had their own rise and fall, but that is a topic for another video. Anyways, with their digital distributor sorted out and an eye for reality TV production, Davies & Co. turned their attention to the next big phase of their combat sports takeover, a mobile game.
Ready? Fight! Great varied attack. Tricep strap. It takes skill to execute this well.
Yes, perhaps XARM's greatest legacy is the now defunct iOS and Android mobile game where you mash your screen to simulate mashing your opponent's face in an XARM competition. The game was called XARM FU, or XARM FU, I'm not really sure which. Unfortunately, regardless, it seems to be no longer available in at least the iOS store, which is a shame. But back to XARM itself and its 2011-2012 relaunch. One of the founding partners in XARM, a guy called Alan Winters, said in an interview with MMA Junkie, quote, "What everybody saw with XARM back a couple years ago was a pretty primitive version of where we're headed with it. The technology that we're going to build into this is going to be really interesting because people don't see it anywhere else," end quote. Reading that quote, it almost sounds as if XARM learned from 2008, as if they went back to the drawing board and reimagined their pseudo-sport as something remotely palatable by the audience at large. They did not.
It helps to have a strong arm, but that's not what this is about. It's fighting.
It's somewhat borderline insane because there's nowhere to go. You know, there's nowhere to hide. You're strapped to that table.
It's chess, but you can get knocked out.
Now, spoiler alert here, guys. XARM never became the next big thing in combat sports. It never supplanted the UFC, and none of us are lining up to buy XARM 74 on pay-per-view. Despite an insane ESPN article from the time proclaiming, "We got a feeling this one's gonna pan out," it never even came close. This bizarre fever dream of an enterprise died with a whimper. I mean, XARM pretty much rode off into the sunset and nobody noticed? Were the reality TV folks not happy with what they saw? Did they burn through all their investor money? Did they have problems with the machinima distribution? We just don't know. And the really crazy thing about this is, despite most of it happening less than a decade ago, there is very little reliable information out there about XARM. All of Machinima's YouTube videos have been wiped from the earth at this point. The XARM official website has been down for years, and their Twitter account hasn't posted in 8 years. In fact, the only repository of any first-hand information available seems to be their now dead Facebook page, which does still include some videos and some pictures. In interviews leading up to XARM's relaunch, Davie and his co-founders proclaimed XARM to be a digital-first product. It would air directly online. It would have its own mobile game tie-in, and it would be optimized for the small screens of smartphones and PC monitors, not television. And you've got to find a little irony that this digital-first company, that this production team with an eye for online, has essentially been wiped from existence from the internet.